Hi, well, welcome everyone to the third of our series of 5G webinars. For those who don't know me, my name is Paul Graham and I head up the telecom sector group at Phil Fisher. And I'm delighted to be joined as a co-host by Liz Blunsdon, who's a partner and leading light in our energy sector group. For those of you who've dialed into previous webinars, you'll know in the first two sessions, we looked at the critical role of fibre in 5G deployments and looked at the likely phased rollout of 5G and how this was reflected in deployment plans and the work of the standards bodies such as 3GPP. Well, in this webinar and a further webinar that's taking place next month, we're sort of reflecting a shift in industry focus towards fine-tuning of 5G deployments and the cost optimization challenges that operators are currently facing. And today we're particularly going to focus on energy costs as a component of overall network operating costs. So in terms of the running agenda, I'll give a brief overview, spend about 5 or 6 minutes talking about the total cost of ownership drivers for network operators and some of the cost accelerators, so that those items of network spend that are likely to increase quite significantly and need to be managed from the operator's perspective. And then the meat of the session will be delivered by Liz, and she'll talk about minimizing energy costs in networks and also some of the renewable energy options for operators. So if we can go on to the next slide. Great. Okay, so on this slide, which originates from the GSMA, you can see on the left-hand side some of the 5G strategy and deployment decisions operators are facing, together with some forecast figures for mobile data traffic growth. And in essence, we think operators will be somewhere on the continuum between adopting a sort of very rapid, full-scale, standalone 5G deployment strategy, and that has got potential cost increases of up to 71%, or right at the right end of the continuum, a highly measured deployment plan, which may sort of predominantly focus on capacity backfilling, which has a much lower cost increase impact of around 25%, according to the GSMA. And then on the right-hand side of the slide are the different components that make up this increase in cost. So the first is the role of massive MIMO in terms of network densification. And I think Huawei has predicted that things like massive MIMO and moving to 64 by 64 MIMO could increase energy consumption from about 5 to 7 kilowatts per 4G site to over 20 kilowatts per 5G site. And so if we can then go on to the next slide that talks about those different cost accelerators. So the first is a sort of densified radio access network upgrade program. And that's going to be typically 45 to 50% of network cost of ownership. And the point here is the capital investment needed to fulfill 5G's promise is huge. So whereas 4G LTE relied upon relatively few masts that are built miles apart, 5G will require lots of small cells much closer together. So things like streetworks installations every few hundred feet in dense urban areas, and maybe putting equipment on the side of buildings. And really building these sorts of networks is going to take a lot of time and is expensive. And so cost reduction efforts are going to take center stage for many operators in terms of the RAN upgrade. In addition to those site upgrades, operators are going to need to look at backhaul capacity. So they're likely to have to upgrade thousands of lines between the upgraded RAN sites and the BT local exchanges. And in the UK for 5G standalone deployments, for many sites, this means moving from a lease line or microwave connectivity of about 500 megabits per second to fiber connections of in excess of 10 gigabits per second. And for some millimeter wave small cells, they can require up to 40 gigabits per second dark fiber connections. Onto sort of energy requirements. Well, if you think about those site deployment and upgrades, the main capacity of a lot of existing sites may not support 5G requirements, particularly if the operator is going to support 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G on the same site. And so that may require capacity expansion alongside backup power and cooling systems also needing to be upgraded. And so all of this is going to add substantial costs in terms of more complex maintenance and potentially higher lease costs to accommodate new equipment and cabinets. And lastly, mobile data traffic growth of up to 50% is going to drive an increase in power consumption, despite the efforts of the industry to make 5G more efficient on a per bit basis. And then the last issue on the slide is the requirements of mobile edge computing. So one challenge the industry faces is that currently many mobile networks operate on a fairly centralized basis with data centers that are connected via backhaul links to mobile base stations. With the requirement for very low latency, mobile operators are looking to push data centers closer to the edge of the network, and the cost of the transmission links to achieve this are going to be pretty expensive. So if we can go on to our next slide. But it's not all bad news in terms of there are significant areas where operators can look to optimize these costs. And I'll briefly touch on a couple of these points because we're going to pick them up in a further webinar that James Walsh and I are going to do on the 24th of November. So the first is sort of virtualized RAN, and that virtualizing the radio access network infrastructure can deliver substantial cost savings on a like-for-like basis when you compare it to a traditional RAN infrastructure. However, I think these cost savings could well be heavily offset when you look at the required backhaul and front haul upgrades, because typically to support that sort of deployment, you'll require expensive high-end fiber transmission links. And then the other thing that operators will need to look at is automation in the network. So there's quite a lot of scope to reap significant savings by using automation to deliver services. So for example, deploying automation for the setup and management of network slices, including configuration of the underlying IP network. As I said, I won't go into more detail today. That's for another day on the 24th. So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, and actually, if we can skip one further. Great. So this diagram takes each of the cost accelerators and assesses its contribution to the total cost of ownership of a 5G network. So in essence, it's quite involved, but the size of the bubble effectively represents the size of the relevant share of 5G network spend. On the horizontal axis, you've got the relative changing cost for 5G networks when compared to 4G networks. And as you can see, network components such as energy have a disproportionately larger impact on the total cost of ownership for 5G networks. And therefore, operators, I think, are going to need to pay more financial attention to reducing energy costs. Alongside this, of course, you've got many national governments requiring businesses to adhere to energy reforms, such as the EU's 2030 Climate and Energy Framework, with the overall goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. So at this point, I'll hand over to Liz, who can describe the various options for reducing energy costs and what the renewable energy options are for operators.
Thanks very much, Paul. Very useful introduction. As Paul said, I'm a partner in our energy team with particular expertise around sort of sourcing and supplying power. And I will fess up now, I know not very much at all about telecommunications. So this has been a really interesting discussing this with Paul as we sort of set this up and understanding, how your industry works compared with the industry I'm more familiar with. As Paul said, I think everyone knows energy costs are already a significant proportion of the OPEX that you guys have to deal with day to day, and 5G can only expand that, sometimes by many factors. Set against the usual, electricity costs, but in particular are volatile, famously difficult to predict. And if you just look at the price curves for this year, the electricity wholesale price has been bouncing up and down all over the place due to COVID, for example. Lots of offshore wind coming on when demand isn't met, whatever. It's a very difficult area to actually get any forward view on price, which makes your lives more difficult because you're trying to hedge your requirements forward in a market where forward visibility after sort of 2.5 years is really quite tricky. Throw into that mix the sustainability agenda, which Paul mentioned just as he was wrapping up there. This is no longer a nice to have. You have to be demonstrating sustainability adherence. You have to take various things into account. It will only become more important, the whole reputational risk around not being seen as sustainable. Telecommunications is not massively targeted at the moment by the sort of green warriors, but it uses a lot of electricity, and who knows that won't change in future. Which leads us to what can you do to manage your energy consumption, to reduce your energy costs, to improve sustainability? How do you wrap all that together? And there's a sort of broad categories just set out here. There's the obvious one, and the lowest hanging fruit of all is energy efficiency. And we've done a lot of work with various companies who now provide energy efficiency as a service. But that tends to be much more around sort of facilities management, sorting out your heating, your lighting, that sort of thing. When the bulk of your energy needs is actually in the network itself, there's stuff that can be done, I'm sure, but it's not probably going to be the thing that really fixes the issue. Network management is sometimes a subset of energy efficiency, but in of its own right is also an important key. Smart systems using artificial intelligence to manage your networks, making sure it's operating properly. I suspect that the telecoms industry is very similar to the energy industry in that decentralization has become a much bigger issue than anyone who ever designed the original system thought it would be. Paul was talking there about sort of being on the edges of networks, and that's becoming an increasing issue in the energy system as well. The distribution networks are now doing far more work than they ever were designed to do, and indeed the regulation hasn't caught up with it either. So being able to use distribution networks as opposed to the transmission network in the most optimal way is a little bit hit and miss at the moment, because it depends which distribution network operator you get. I'm not going to cover that in any detail today because it's a topic in its own right, but it's an interesting one, and I think one to watch as we move forward into the sort of net zero world. How the distribution network operators run their systems and how they interact with customers, I think, is going to change, particularly large customers like you guys with lots and lots of load. And then the other sort of obvious one, which I'm going to focus on mostly today, is sort of alternative energy sources and alternative energy procurement processes, if you like, procurement strategies. Just a quick sort of diversion into sustainability, because we really, if we're going to talk about renewables and energy, I think you have to just touch on it. The amount of stakeholder pressure that every company in the country is now getting around sustainability is ever increasing. You hear these sort of acronyms, and at the moment it's ESG, environmental, social and governance. There isn't actually a set definition for that. it tends to be, if you look in a dictionary, it's sort of all about looking at a company's non-financial performance, so environmental policies, ethical position, how happy are its employees, etc., etc. So it's quite a difficult one to nail down, but it's not going away, and it may crystallize into something more formal. We may move into a slightly different emphasis, I don't know, but the environmental impact of everybody's business is clearly going to be a big issue going forward, and one of the one of the more obvious ways to improve your environmental credentials is to use renewable energy, not without its challenges in terms of actually getting hold of the stuff and reporting it, but having a renewable energy strategy is something that has been at the forefront of many companies' general overall strategies. And you only have to look at something like the RE100, which is a really good example of really big companies coming together and not only committing to procure renewable energy, but also committing to advocate for policy change, to lobby governments to make buying renewable energy easier, to make it more transparent, and to generally improve the environmental issues around energy consumption. I've put net zero on there because we can't really sort of get away from it. It was Theresa May's parting shot as she left government was to pass a statutory instrument which committed the UK to a net zero target, which is laudable and a fantastic thing to do. What we don't have is really much of the detail, and we just don't know how that requirement to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions will pan out. I suspect it will flow through into obligations on probably every company in the country, eventually, on the way they do things, on the way they use energy. So I think that one will only increase in terms of regulation and the sort of obligations that you're required to comply with by law. But in the meantime, it's worth having a look at some of the other things that can be done. So if we start to focus on the sort of the main thrust of this, which is energy procurement, all of you buy energy in large quantities at the moment. The key to all energy procurement in the UK at the moment is the licensed energy suppliers. So, the SSEs, the Centricas, the Ppas, Octopus, OVO, all those guys, they're licensed energy suppliers. They supply energy to premises, and they are really the pivot point between customers and what's going on within the wider network, the distribution network, transmission network, generation. Customers don't see that, they just see the energy supplier. And the energy supplier also looks the other way into the industry, but it controls the meter. And the meter is what, as in all metered industries, the meter is what controls flow in and off the system, into and out of the system. The supply market is pretty brutal. It's very competitive. Despite the rumours of massive profits in the papers, they actually have very thin margins. It's a volume game. And as a rule, corporate customers have traditionally changed their supplier pretty regularly. 18 months to 3 years, there are tender processes that run through, and it keeps the competitive tension in the market, and big corporates can and do move their accounts. There's lots and lots of negotiations around price and product and what you're going to get. But the system is designed so that you can change supplier, hopefully seamlessly, and it's all done behind the scenes. So as an end user, you should never see any of the process that has to go on behind it. In the last 20 years, probably 15, it's really taken off. We've seen renewable generation come onto the system. So whereas we used to just have big coal-fired, big gas-fired, and big nuclear stations churning out power straight onto the transmission network, the last 20-25 years, we've seen much smaller, intermittent, renewable generation coming onto the system. Tends to be connected at the distribution level, which is one of these issues that I was just talking about earlier when I talked about decentralization. The system wasn't ever engineered to have power coming into it from the very ends, but that's what we now have to live with. And as a result of all those projects coming online, we've seen various changes to the way that some people buy energy. One option is to just buy a green tariff from a supplier. They've been around for quite a long time and are increasingly common, particularly for domestic customers because it's easy. But historically, they've been more expensive than buying non-green power, if you like. And there's always been a little bit of an issue around demonstrating that those tariffs are actually green, partly because a bit like telecoms, once you put whatever you're putting onto the network, you have no way of telling whether that particular little bit of electricity, A, where it came from, or B, whether it's green or not. So you have to jump through all sorts of hypothetical hoops to demonstrate greenness. But renewable energy tariffs have always been seen as a little bit of a sort of conglomerate of brown and green, and therefore perhaps not the best green credentials. So one thing that some corporates have been doing is entering into corporate PPAs, which I'm sure you've heard of. They've been around in the market for, I don't know, we saw our first one probably 15 years ago, something like that. And it's a direct contract between the corporate and the generator. And the idea behind that is it allows the generator to build its project. It gives the corporate the right to say that project is being built because of us, therefore it's additional. And it also gives the corporate access to green certificates or whatever green environmental benefits are being produced by the project. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the different types and how they might fit into your current portfolio on the next couple of slides. Another option for renewable generation is actually to procure your own on site or get someone else to install something on site and then offtake green generation from that project. Can work very well, but again, I'll come on to some more detail around that in some of the subsequent slides. Again, without wishing to sort of teach grandma to suck eggs, there are some immutable facts in the electricity industry, just as there are in the telecoms industry, and that's really the route that power takes when it gets to a customer. So if you take all these pink ovals there that are labeled site, that's a single customer's multiple sites. And what you normally get is there's a contract with the supplier between the customer and the supplier, and then the supplier is responsible for providing electricity to all those sites. Sitting behind that, you've got the national grid and the distribution network, so high voltage, low voltage. The supplier looks into those, but the customer doesn't. And then on the other side of the grid, in the schematic, are all the generators putting power onto the system. And the power goes from generator across wires to the customer. The way the system is set up at the moment, and indeed probably it will be difficult to change it because the laws of physics are tricky like that. That's the way it is, and that's what you've got to work with. You can't change that, but you can change some of the contractual relationships, and that's really what we want to investigate a little bit today. So I've already mentioned the corporate PPA. These come in broadly two flavors within which there are various different forms, but they either come in the physical or the financial version. In both of them, the corporate, i.e. you, would contract directly with a generator and enter into a contract for power and green certificates. Anything involving a physical contract will obviously need a licensed supplier because you can't take electricity. You're not allowed to because you're not licensed. You need a licensed supplier to take that electricity. So there will need to be some sort of arrangement around how that works. On the financial side, these are essentially derivatives and no power actually is deemed to be delivered. So you don't need a licensed supplier directly in that contractual relationship. You will need to talk to your licensed supplier if you want to hedge the arrangement. But there are other issues around financial, which again we'll come on to. On-site generation, as I said, can be an attractive option. It depends very much whether you've got the space and what sort of electricity. Electricity is electricity, but do you need it for security of supply? Do you need it for green credentials? You know, what sort of technology suits your on-site requirement? Again, we'll come on to that. And then finally, you know, can you change the technology? Can you look at new technology? And energy storage is obviously something that's talked about a great deal and has great potential. It also has a few stumbling blocks which will need to be overcome in the next couple of years if it's going to become as useful as it could be. So this looks a bit more complicated than it really is, but is an attempt to show you how in a physically delivered corporate PPA, the relationships work as opposed to what we had before, which was generator, grid, supplier, end user. So your end user still physically gets power from the licensed supplier, but the end user also has a contract direct with the generator. And that contract says to the generator, you will deliver power to the corporate, but the corporate won't actually take it. It's the licensed supplier who has to take it because of the licensing requirements. So you have a PPA that looks to all intents and purposes like a normal power purchase agreement between a generator and an off-taker. But there's some wording in there which means that the delivery obligation is satisfied when the power goes to the licensed supplier. Why would you do that? As I said earlier, you get a direct relationship with the generator, which is very good for your additionality compliance. It allows you, to an extent, to control what the generator does. It will inevitably get you green certificates, which would be renewable energy guarantees of origin in the UK now if it's a new project. If it was an older project, there would be a clause about ROC certificates. But it gives you direct relationship. You can say the project's being built because of you. You've got your green power. On the pricing and tenor side, inevitably they are for a fixed price for quite a long period of time. So 10 to 15 years is not uncommon. And that's where the point I made earlier about the supply contracts normally changing every 3 years comes in, because you have to square off, particularly with the procurement team, that rather than having a 2 to 3 year arrangement where you have essentially a price reopener at the end of that, which will keep your supplier keen and make sure that it's competitive and all the rest of it, you're entering into an agreement for 10 to 15 years on a fixed price, which might be indexed, might not. It can be a little bit of a leap of faith, and as I say, it's very difficult to predict electricity prices, but it does give you a fixed price moving forward. So if you take into account your view of the fixed price and your view of the sustainability requirements, etc., at least you know what you're in for. So it can be quite an effective way of at least making sure that your costs are certain over the ensuing years. Generators like them because obviously you've got a long-term offtake contract at a fixed price, which means if you're financing a project to develop a wind farm or whatever, you've got a predetermined, secure income going forward from a corporate who hopefully has a good credit rating. If not, then there's a corporate guarantee somewhere or a bank guarantee. So the generator can go to its bank and say, look, we have an offtake contract. We can model this cash flow and therefore we can finance the project. It's called sleeved at the top because once you've done your PPA with the generator, you then need to come to some sort of arrangement with the licensed supplier. The PPA between the generator and the corporate will say, our licensed supplier will deal with the physical offtake, but then the corporate needs to go to a licensed supplier and say, right, we need you to take this electricity into your aggregated portfolio. The terms of that depend very much on the relationship between the corporate and the licensed supplier, and obviously the bigger the corporate, the more clout you have with the supplier and the more you can get them to play ball. You can either do it so that the licensed supplier just essentially buys the power from the corporate in a notional transaction, or you can net the volumes out. You can do various things, but you need that licensed supplier to take the power. The issue around structuring these agreements is you probably still want to be changing that licensed supplier every few years, because not all your power will be coming from renewable generation. It will be coming from those other sources. You've got a much bigger portfolio. You still want to keep that licensed supplier keen. So how do you deal with the change of licensed supplier under the corporate PPA, which is 10 to 15 years long? That depends very much on the agreement between the generator and the corporate. In the best world scenario for the generator, the PPA stays the same and the corporate bears the risk. And then there are shades of between no changes at all to the PPA and a change of supplier through some changes to allowing the supplier to redictate the terms. That is always a sticky bit of any negotiation between the generator and the corporate, working out how you deal with that. An on-site private wire arrangement looks a lot simpler, and can work very well if certain criteria are met. I mean, first of all, you need the space to install on-site generation, and that may be an issue for some telecoms companies, because you don't tend to have, it sits really well on a massive, great manufacturing site that's got loads and loads of space on it. It can be difficult on a tight site. The reason you have it on site is to get round some of the licensing requirements around supply, because if the power goes from the generator to the corporate's premises on site, you can benefit from a licensing exemption. So you don't have that whole regulated piece, and there are other cost benefits which I'll come on to. But as I say, you need the space. You also need to work out whether the type of generation you're looking at actually suits your demand profile. If you're going to put solar panels onto a site where you've got a data center where your load is actually fairly flat and very, very sensitive to any fluctuation, the solar panels are only ever going to be a top-up, essentially. But you could install a biomass fueled CHP plant, for example, and use that as your primary source of heat and power. It just depends on what you're looking at, what you need. The other sort of cost benefit, which I alluded to just a minute ago, because you are taking power from the generator directly on site, it doesn't go via the grid, which means you don't have to pay grid system use of system charges. So the power price can be a lot lower. Of course, the power price is lower, but somebody has to pay for the infrastructure and the kit to build the generator. So the cost of that, if you procure it yourself, obviously you've got to pay that as capex, and then you've got to run the opex as you go along, or you can get someone else to do it for you and install it as a project. And the power price should still be lower if the economics work than importing from the grid, because, as I'm sure all of you know, when you actually get the electricity bill, an awful lot of it is system charges, levies, taxes, various other items which are not related to the cost of electricity. You will always, as the corporate, need a connection out to the grid and a licensed supplier there. Even if you've got, say, a CHP plant that notionally meets your demand, you will always need the ability to import power when that plant is under maintenance or is broken or whatever. So you will always need a grid connection. The generator will also always want some sort of route out to market if that corporate essentially fails, becomes insolvent, goes away. Some of my trickiest and most bad-tempered negotiations have been around how you get grid access from that generator out to the system if the corporate fails. It's one of those things that otherwise you end up with a stranded asset, and that doesn't work for the generator or its financiers. You don't have to do a physical PPA. You can do a financial PPA instead. This works like a standard swap. So standard derivative, you would enter into an arrangement, which is the bottom line, financial hedge, PPA, goes all the way, the arrow should go from the corporate all the way through to the generator. And the generator, again, gets a fixed price for 10, 15 years. And the corporate is exposed to the market price, so pays the the difference between the floating market price, either is paid it by the generator or pays to the generator when the market price is below the strike price. The green certificates flow through from the generator to the corporate, and again, as the corporate when you're developing a renewable project, you would claim additionality, because you would claim that the financial hedge is the means by which the contract gets the generator gets its fixed price, and therefore the project would not be financeable without it. Because it's a financial instrument, it's not suitable for all off-takers. It is a financial product, it's a derivative, therefore it is subject to financial regulation, so you need, corporate would normally need to be regulated. There are accounting issues around accounting for derivatives. You can end up with very, very large numbers going onto your accounts as a result of derivatives, which can be difficult to manage. And because of the mark-to-market exposure on the derivative, the credit of the corporate is particularly important, and you may need to provide credit support, which can be expensive and very long-term. It's the sort of arrangement that is favoured by the big tech companies, so the likes, Microsoft and Google make no secret that they do these sorts of contracts. Some of the very large, highly credit-rated companies will also enter into these sorts of arrangements. They can work very well. The documentation at core is, as I say, just a derivative, so you can use an ISDA, the standard swap arrangement. Not that common in Northern Europe. It's commoner in sort of Iberia and sort of Southern Europe to use the ISDAs. But in Northern Europe, you tend to get a bespoke contract, and it varies by counterparty, but you get a degree of physical obligations as well in those financial PPAs. So the core of it is a financial swap, but you will also see obligations to develop the project, obligations to get it accredited for green certificates, to run it in a certain way, and all the rest of it. And that's really driving at the green credentials side of it, so that the corporate can say, well, we are invested in this project, and we also have rights to ensure that it is run properly and accredited, and etc., etc., etc. If you enter into one of these as a corporate, obviously you're going to be exposed on the financial hedge, so you would need to hedge your position, and you may get the power, you may require or request that the license supplier takes the power, supplies it onto you, or you can have it sent into the market, and then your supplier will provide that volume back to you round this sort of loop here. Various ways of managing that, but it will leave the corporate with a big exposure, which will then need to be managed. So it tends to be used by quite sophisticated players, because they're expensive to negotiate, and they are, say, quite complicated to run sometimes. Settlement is not easy either. Other technologies beyond the sort of classic renewables technologies of solar, wind, biomass generation, batteries are clearly going to be part of the landscape going forward. They are very useful for managing the intermittency that you get in renewable generation. Anything that relies on the weather is not going to be generating all the time, and batteries can help to smooth out that up and down nature, if you like. They're also useful if you need a secure supply. If you've got a technology that absolutely has to have power, a battery can be very useful insurance, in effect, against outages or dips or whatever. They make a lot of sense when deployed with other renewable technology. You can also use them to provide services back to the grid, and probably topic for another webinar, because we haven't got time to go into it today. But active energy management on the network and providing grid services back to the distribution network operators and national grid going forward may well be something you might want to get involved in, because it will be quite lucrative. It does require an awful lot of active management, and you've probably got enough on your plates right now, but it's certainly one to look at in future. But the big problem with batteries is they are expensive. They were touted around the industry, the electricity industry, about 3-4 years ago. Everyone was looking at storage, but the combination of the costs haven't really reduced, and the government policy around them was very, very vague at the time. And because of one thing and another hasn't really been clarified since, there haven't been as many battery projects as we would have liked, but they are certainly going to feature going forward. And we know that lithium ion is probably the best technology at the moment that's commercially available. Say still very expensive, but there are lots of people working on beyond lithium ion, other sorts of battery, other sorts of cells, making things more efficient, etc., which can only be a good thing, because obviously the rare earths involved in making these batteries are not easy to get hold of, and I think that will probably be a limiting factor ultimately going into the sort of the medium term. But there are lots of other clever people doing research and building energy storage, and it ranges from the factory in the US where they've got a steel train full of rocks that they pull up to the top of a hill when the energy price is low and then rumble it down when it's not. There's hydro around, which is obviously quite old now, but you can have run of river hydro rather than the pump storage. That can be used. You can have compressed air, you can have thermal storage, which is quite an interesting one. Have cold stores, have heat sinks, and use that not just to produce electricity, but also to meet your cooling needs. If you've got a mixed use site, sometimes you can do that. So I think the general thinking is sort of expanding out, and people are becoming more creative around how you can manage energy, how you can store it, how you can use it. And we are in a bit of a state of flux with energy policy at the moment. We're due a white paper as of, I think it was summer 2019, but it's still not arrived. But there hasn't been any sort of real policy shifts in the last 18 months, which in some ways is a good thing because the market's just getting on with it. But I think we will see some more energy policy, and there's also some policy around net zero and the industrial strategy due to be published this autumn. So I think we will see a little bit more guidance from government on what they're expecting, but the general direction of travel is towards more sustainable industry, better use of renewables, better use of the distribution networks, because that is potentially a bit of a blocker. I don't know if any of you ever tried to get an electricity connection on a distribution network, but it can be fairly painful. So that there's definitely an issue there, which I think will need to be resolved. That was all I wanted to say in that quick canter through. Obviously very happy to take any questions or comments. Paul, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, so there's a chat box for questions, and one we've had is in corporate PPA deals, how prevalent are take or pay obligations? Are they pretty standard, or?
That's an interesting one, because by sort of original training, I was a gas lawyer many years ago, where take or pay has a very specific meaning. What most corporate PPAs have is a take if generated. So if the renewable source is generating, then the power will be taken by the supplier. I mean, actually, in real life, you have to have that because they're not dispatchable. You can't tell them when to run, and the power just flows onto the system anyway. So it will always go into the account of the supplier. So what the PPAs say is, if the power is generated, then it will be taken by the corporate. You then have to have sitting behind that at the supplier level, either some sort of netting of the volume that goes to your sites, or the supplier may trade it away in the market if there's too much. So it's not a classic take or pay, but there is certainly an obligation to take whatever turns up, and ultimately the financial consequences of that, I guess, will flow through to the corporate. What there isn't is a minimum take, a minimum volume on the generator. So the generator is just obliged to generate when it can and provide what it can in the intermittent technologies. So again, you have to manage you have to manage that sort of profile coming from the generator within the sort of little mini portfolio of your own supply. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I don't think there seem to be any other questions, but if you are on the line and want to ask questions later, then send them through to Liz or myself in that order, I suspect. And I think a recording of this webinar will be available, so Chloe will send that out afterwards. And the last thing is just a plug for our Open RAN webinar session, which will be running on the 24th of November. So we'll send out details nearer to the time.
Okay.
Perfect.